Hey guys, welcome back. Hope you guys enjoyed the last one. Now, I do want to ask real quick, I put it in the description of the last one, but I'll ask for this video for those who don't read the description boxes. Are you guys liking the hour video? Or would you guys like me to split the chapters in half? Because when I read the chapters, each chapter is an hour long. So what I can do is I can read the whole chapter, but just divide the videos in half. So like one day I can upload the half-hour portion, and then the next day or two, I can upload the second half of that chapter. Let me know down in the comments if you guys would like that, or if you guys would like me to stick with just doing the hour. It's up to you guys. I just wanted to know if you guys would prefer it being chopped up or just in, one whole. I do have a special dedication video coming up in probably the next couple of days or so, depending on when I hear back from some folks, but I hope you guys will like that as well. But other than that, we are going to get back into our book. For those who are new, this is Howard Zinn's The People's History of the United States. It's a wonderful book if you guys are history folks like myself. I was a history buff in high school. I loved it a lot. I'm hoping to learn a lot more as I go, like I have been. And this is something that is very important to learn. Facts and information and just statistics and learning things maybe you didn't get taught in school, or if you did, you just don't remember them as much. So I think this is a great refresher and to kind of enhance your history, your knowledge that you had, or even you're studying history, this would be a great book to look into as well. Other than that, let's go ahead and check out what Chapter 6 has to tell us. So Chapter 6, The Intimately Oppressed. It is possible, reading standard histories, to forget half the population of the country. The explorers were men, the landholders and merchants men. The political leaders men, the military figures men. The very invisibility of women, the overlooking of women, is a sign of their submerged status. What it's referring to is that in this time period, women had no say in pretty much anything ever. For, I think, till like around the 1900s, when you saw women getting the right to vote. You saw them being able to run for political office and seek occupations, those who are more professional status that were usually occupied by men. So this is what he's referring to. In this invisibility, they were something like black slaves, and thus slave women faced a double oppression. The biological uniqueness of women, like skin color and facial characteristics of Negroes, became a basis for treating them as inferiors. True, with women there was something more practically important in their biology than skin color, their position as childbearers, but this was not enough to account for the general push backward for all of them in society. Even those who did not bear children, or those too young or too old for that, who could use, exploit, and cherish someone who was at the same time servant, sex mate, companion, and bearer, teacher, warden of his children. Society is based on private property and competition, in which monogamous families became practical units for work and socialization, found it especially useful to establish this special status for women. Some things akin to a house slave in the matter of intimacy and oppression, and yet requiring, because of that intimacy and long-term connection with children, a special patronization, which on occasion, especially in the face of a show of strength, could slip over into treatment as an equal, and oppression so private were turned out hard to uproot. Earlier societies, in America and elsewhere, in which property was held in common and families were extensive and complicated, with aunts and uncles, and grandmothers and grandfathers, all living together, seemed to treat women more as equals than did the white societies that overran them, bringing, quote, civilization and private property. And the Zuni tribes of the Southwest, for instance, extended families, large clans, were based on the women, whose husband came to live with her family. It was assumed that women owned the houses, the fields belonging to the clans, and the women had equal rights to what was produced. A woman was more secure because she was with her own family. She could divorce the man when she wanted to, keeping their property. And that is something a lot of people don't know, is European culture was all about male domination, and women are the subservient class. They're the ones who kind of bear the children and run the household, and that's about it. While in the Indian tribes and Native American culture, everyone was treated as equal. There was no hierarchy, there was no, domination over one class or one race over the other. It was all equality for them. Women in the Plains Indian tribes in the Midwest did not have farming duties, but had a very important place in the tribe as healers, herbalists, and sometimes holy people who gave advice. When bands lost their male leaders, women became chieftains. Women learned to shoot small bows, and they carried knives, because among the Sioux, a woman who was opposed to be able to defend herself against attack. The puberty or ceremony of the Sioux was such as to give pride to a young Sioux maiden. Now a little passage from this writing. Walk the good road, my daughter, and the buffalo herds, white and dark as cloud shadows, moving over the prairie, will follow you. Be dutiful, respectful, gentle, and modest. My daughter, my proud walking is the pride and the virtue of the women are lost. The spring will come, but the buffalo trails will turn to grass. Be strong with the warm, strong heart of the earth. No people go down until their women are weak and dishonored. It would be an exaggeration to say that women were treated equally with men, but they were treated with respect, and the communal nature of the society gave them a more important place. The conditions under which white settlers came to America created various situations for women, where the first settlers consisted almost entirely of men. Women were imported as sex slaves, childbearers, companions. In 1619, the year that the first black slave came to Virginia, 90 women arrived at Jamestown on one ship. Agreeable persons and young and corrupt, sold with their own consent to settlers as wives, the price to be the cost of their own transportation. Many women came to those early years as indentured servants, often teenage girls, and lived lives not much different from slavery, except that the terms of service had an end. See the difference? They were to be obedient masters, to masters and mistresses, which you'll see common in today's culture too. The authors of America's Working Women, Baxendale, Gordon, and Reverby, describe this situation. Quote, they were poorly paid, and often treated rudely and harshly, deprived of good food and privacy. Of course, these terrible conditions provoked resistance, living in separate families without much contact with others in their position. Indentured servants had one primary path of resistance open to them: passive resistance, trying to do as little work as possible and to create difficulties from the masters and mistresses. Of course, the masters and mistresses did not interpret it that way, but saw the difficult behavior of their servants as sullenness, laziness, malevolence, and stupidity. For instance, the General Court of Connecticut in 1645 ordered that a certain, quote, Susan Z., for her rebellious carriage toward her mistress, to be sent to the House of Correction and be kept to hard labor and coarse diet, to be brought forth the next lecture day to be publicly corrected, and to be corrected weekly until order be given to the contrary. Unquote. Sexual abuse of masters against servant girls became commonplace, and so was with slaves. The court records of Virginia and other colonies show masters brought into court for this, so we can assume that these were especially flagrant cases. There must have been many more instances never brought to public light. In 1756, Elizabeth Spriggs wrote to her father about her servitude. What we, unfortunate English people, suffer here is beyond the probability of you and England to conceive. Let it suffice that I, one of the unhappy number, am toiling almost day and night, and very often in the horse's drudgery, with only this comfort that you bitch you do not have enough, and then tied up and whipped to the degree that you not serve as an animal, scarce in anything but Indian corn and salt to eat, and not even begrudged, nay, many Negroes are better used, almost naked, no shoes, no stockings to wear. What rest we can get is wrapped to ourselves upon the blanket and lie upon the ground. Whatever horrors can be imagined, and the transport of black slaves to America must be multiplied for black women, who were often 1/3 of the cargo, slave traders reported. I saw pregnant women give birth to babies while chained to corpses. which our drunken overseers had not removed. Packed spoon fashion, they often gave birth to children, and their scalding perspiration from the human cargo. On board the ship was a young Negro, claimed to chain the deck, who had lost her senses soon after she was purchased and taken aboard. A woman named Linda Brent, who escaped from slavery, told of another burden. But I now entered, on my 15th year, a sad epoch in the life of a slave girl. My master began to whisper foul words in my ear. Young as I was, I could not remain ignorant of their import. My master met me at every turn, reminding me that I belonged to him, and swearing by heaven and earth that he would not compel me to submit to him, if I went out for a breath of fresh air after a day of unwearied toil. His footsteps dogged me. If I knelt by my mother's grave, his dark shadow fell on me there. The light heart, which nature had given me, became heavy with sad forebodings. Even free white women, not brought as servants or slaves, but as wives of the early settlers, faced special hardships. 18 married women came over on the Mayflower. 3 were pregnant, and 1 of them gave birth to a dead child before they landed. Childbirth and sickness plagued the women. By the spring, only 4 of those 18 women were still alive. Those who lived sharing the work of building a life in the wilderness with their men were often given a special respect because they were so badly needed. And when men died, women often took up the men's work as well. All through the 1st century and more, women on the American frontier seemed close to equality with their men. But all women were burdened with ideas carried over from England with the colonists. Influenced by Christian teachings, English law was summarized in a document of 1632 entitled, quote, "The Laws and Resolutions of Women's Rights." In this consolidation, which we call wedlock is a locking together, it is true that the man and wife are one person, but understand in one manner, when a small brook, or little over incorporate, with rudeness, Humber or the Thames, the poor revolute loseth her name. A woman as soon as she is married is called covert, that is called veiled, as it were clouded and overshadowed. She hath lost her stream. I may more truly fare away to say a married woman. Her new self is her superior, her companion, her master. Julius Bruegel describes the woman's legal situation in the colonial period as, quote, "The husband's control over the wife's person extended to the right of giving her chastisement, but he was not entitled to inflict permanent injury or death on his wife." As for property, quote, "Besides absolute possession of his wife's personal property and a life estate in her lands, the husband took any other income that might be hers. Her collected wages earned by her labor, naturally it followed that her proceeds of the joint labor of husband and wife belonged to the husband." End quote. For a woman to have a child out of wedlock was a crime, and colonial records are full of cases of women being arraigned for, quote, bastardy, end quote, the father of the child untouched by the law and on the loose. A colonial periodical of 1747 reproduced a speech, quote, of Miss Polly Baker before a court of judicature at Connecticut near Boston in New England, where she was prosecuted the 5th time for having a bastard child, end quote. The speech was Benjamin Franklin's ironic invention. "May it please the Honourable Bench to indulge me in a few words. I am a poor unhappy woman, who have no money to free lawyers to plead for me. This is the 5th time, gentlemen, that I have been dragged before your court on the same account. Twice I have paid heavy fines, and twice I have been brought to public punishment for want of money to pay those fines. Laws are sometimes unreasonable in themselves, and therefore repealed, and others bear too hard on the subject in particular circumstances. I take the liberty to say that I think this law by which I am punished both unreasonable in itself, particularly severe with regard to me. Abstract from the law I cannot conceive. With the nature of my offenses, I have brought 5 9 children into the world at the risk of my life. I have maintained them well by my own industry, without burdening the township. Would have done it better if I had not been for the heavy charges and fines I have paid. nor has anyone the least of cause complaint against me, unless perhaps the minister of justice, because I have had children without being married, by which they missed a wedding free. But this can be a fault of mine? What must poor young women do, whose customs and nature forbid to solicit the men, who cannot force themselves upon husbands, when the laws take no care to provide them any, and yet severely punish them if they do their duty without them? The duty, the first and great command of nature, and nature's God, increase and multiply, a duty from the steady performance of which nothing has been able to deter me. But for its sake I have hazarded the loss of the public esteem, and have frequently endured public disgrace and punishment, and therefore ought, in my humble opinion, instead of a whipping, to have a statue erected to my memory. The father's position in the family was expressed in the Spectator, an influential periodical in American England. Quote, "Nothing more gratifying to the mind of man than power or dominion, and as I am the father of a family, I am perpetually taken up in every giving out orders, and prescribing duties, and hearing parties, and administering justice, and in distributing rewards and punishments. In short, sir, I look upon my family as a patriarchal sovereignty, in which I myself both king and priest." Unquote. What he's kind of saying is, back in early American times, the father was like the king. He ruled the household, he was in charge, did a lot of the work. He was also the priest, and he was the one who helped preach the gospel to the wife and children, to teach them the word of Christ. So when they were the church, they already know the education ahead of time. They were being disciplined in the word of God. No wonder that Puritan New England carried over this subjection of women, at a trial of a woman for daring to complain about the work a carpenter had done for her. One of the powerful church fathers of Boston, the Reverend John Cotton, said, quote, "That the husband should obey his wife, and not the wife the husband. This is a false principle, for God hath put another law upon woman. Wives, be subject to your husbands in all things." Unquote. A best-selling, quote, pocketbook published in London was widely read in the American colonies in the 1700s. It was called Advice to a Daughter. You must first lay it down, for foundation in general, that there is an inequality in sexes, and that for the better economy of the world, the men who were in the lawgivers had the larger share of reason bestowed upon them, by which your sex is the better prepared for the compliance that is necessary for the performance of those duties which seemed to be most properly assigned to it. Your sex wanteth of our reason for your conduct, and our strength for your protection. Ours wanteth to your gentleness, to soften and to entertain us. Against this powerful education, it is remarkable that women nevertheless rebelled. Women rebels have always faced special disabilities. They live under the daily eye of their master, and they are isolated in the form the other in all sorts, thus missing the daily camaraderie which has given heart to rebels of other oppressed groups. Annie Hutchinson was a religious woman, mother of 13 children, and knowledgeable about healing with herbs. She defied the church fathers in the early years of the Massachusetts Bay Colony by insisting that she and other ordinary people could interpret the Bible for themselves. A good speaker, she held meetings to which more and more women came, even a few men, and soon groups of 60 or more were gathering at her home in Boston to listen to her criticism of local ministers John Winthrop, who is a very important figure in American history, by the way, and to the Dizzy Enlightenment, too. The governor described her as, quote, "women of a haughty and fierce carriage, of a nimble wit and active spirit, and a very voluble tongue, more bold than a man, though in understanding and judgment inferior to many women." End quote. Anne Hutchinson was put on trial twice, by the church for heresy and by the government for challenging their authority. At her civil trial, she was pregnant and ill, but they did not allow her to sit down, and she was weeks. And again she was sick. But she challenged her questioners with expert knowledge of the Bible and remarkable eloquence. When finally she repented in writing, they were not satisfied. They said, quote, "Her repentance is not, and her countenance," end quote. She was banished from the colony, and once she left Rhode Island in 1638, 35 families followed her. There she went to the land, thought she was one of their enemies. They killed her and her family. 20 years later, the one person back in Massachusetts Bay who had spoken up for her during her trial, Mary Dyer, was hanged by the government of the colony, along with 2 other Quakers for, quote, rebellion, sedition, and presumptuous obtruding themselves, end quote. It remained rare for women to participate openly in public affairs, although on the southern and western frontiers, conditions made this occasionally possible. Julia Sproul found in Georgia's early records the story of Mary Mosgrove, Matthew's daughter, of an Indian mother and English father, who could speak the Creek language and became an advisor on Indian affairs to Governor James Oglethorpe of Georgia. Sproul finds that as this communities became more settled, women were thrust back farther from public life, and seemed to have behaved more timorously than before. One petition, quote, "It is not the province of our sex to reason deeply upon the policy of that order," end quote. During the Revolution, however, Sproul's reports on the necessity of war brought women out into public affairs. Women formed patriotic groups, carried out anti-British actions, wrote articles for independence. They were active in the campaign against the British tea tax, which made tea prices intolerably high. They organized Daughters of Liberty, groups boycotting British goods, uprising women to make their own clothes and buy only American-made things. In 1777, there was a women's counterpart to the Boston Tea Party, a quote coffee party, described by Abigail Adams in a letter to her husband John. Now, a couple small facts for you guys. Early America into the American Revolution afterwards, there were a lot of women's movements for women's rights, women who aid their husbands in war, those who, part of these protests like they say here. And also, they mentioned Abigail Adams. Abigail Adams was one of the main advocates for women's rights during this time period. Now, as I say here, she was the husband to John Adams, who was a founding father. And they had disagreements, but Abigail Adams was, like I said, was one of those main figures who helped lead a lot of these women's rights movements during this time period. Now, let's see what she has to say. One eminent, wealthy Stinger merchant, who was a bachelor, had a hogshead of coffee in a store, which he refused to sell to the committee, under 6 shillings per pound. Shilling was the currency before the US dollar. A number of females, some say 100, some say more, assembled with a cart of trunks, marched down to the warehouse and demanded the keys, which he refused to deliver, upon which of one of them seized by his neck and tossed him into the cart. Upon his finding no quarter, he delivered the keys when they tipped up the cart and discharged him, then opened the warehouses, hoisted up the coffee themselves, put it in the trunks and drove off. A large concourse of men stood amazed, silent spectators of the whole transaction. It has been pointed out by women historians recently that the contributions of working-class men in the American Revolution have been mostly ignored. Unlike the genteel wives of the leaders Dolly Madison, Martha Washington, Abigail Adams. Now, Dolly Madison is the wife of James Madison, and Martha Washington was the wife of George Washington. Margaret Corbin called, quote, Dirty Kate, Deborah Sanson Garnett, and, quote, Molly Pitcher were rough, lower-class women, petrified into ladies by historians. Prettified into ladies by historians, while poor women in the last years of the fighting went to army encampments, helped and fought. They were represented later as prostitutes, whereas Martha Washington was given a special place in history books for visiting her husband at Valley Forge. Now, what the author's talking about here is that the wealthier women, those who were in the upper classes or those who were married to politicians, when they meant by prettified, as in the paintings and drawings, they were painting these beautiful women, those who were elegant, peaceful, they were patriotic, they were, the figures of liberty, right? While though a poor underclass woman, those who were, not in the upper class, they're painted as these rugged individuals who disorderly, you couldn't trust these women, they were ugly, whatever, and that's kind of what they're talking about. When feminist impulses are recorded, They are almost always the writings of privileged women who had some status from which to speak freely, more opportunity to write, and have their writings recorded. Abigail Adams. You'll hear a lot more from her later as well. Even before the Declaration of Independence in March of 1776, wrote to her husband, "In the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies, and be more generous to them than your ancestors. Do not put such limited power into the hands of husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention are not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and will not hold ourselves bound to obey the laws in which we have no voice or representation." Now, I mean, she had serious balls to do stuff like this back then. Speaking to her husband that way, and being this figure of women's right movements during this time period where women were seen as underclass subservients. They were servants of the masters. So for her to do all this took a lot of courage, and she should be commended so for it. Nevertheless, Jefferson underscored his phrase, quote, "All men are created equal," end quote. Not really. By his statement that American women would be, quote, "too wise to wrinkle their foreheads with politics," end quote. After the Revolution, none of the new state constitutions granted women the right to vote, except for New Jersey. I didn't know that, by the way. And the state rescinded the right in 1807. New York's constitution specifically disenfranchised women by using the word, quote, "male." How smart. While perhaps 90% of the white male population were literate around 1750, only 40% of the women were. Working class women had little means of communicating, and no means of recording whatever sentiments of rebelliousness they have felt at their subordination. And what he's saying is, since a lot of these women were not educated or taught how to read and write, they were, quote, illiterate. They didn't know how to read, they couldn't write, they couldn't describe what was going on. And that was a way to punish them, as a way to suppress their voice. Not only were they bearing children in great numbers, under great hardships, but they were working in the home. Around the time of the Declaration of Independence, 4,000 women and children in Philadelphia were spending at home for local plants under the, quote, putting out system. Women also were shopkeepers and innkeepers and engaged in many trades. They were bakers, tin workers, brewers, and tanners, robe makers, lumberjacks, printers, morticians, woodworkers, staymakers, and more. Ideas of family equality were in the air during and after the Revolution. Tom Paine spoke out for the equal rights of women, and the pioneering book of Mary Wollstonecraft in England, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, was reprinted in the United States shortly after the Revolutionary War. Wollstonecraft was responding to the English conservative and opponent of the French Revolution, Edmund Burke, who had written in his reflection of the Revolution in France that, quote, "a woman is but an animal, and an animal not of the highest order," end quote, she wrote. "I wish to persuade women to endeavor to acquire strength, both of mind and body, and to conceive them that sought phrases, susceptibility of heart, delicacy of sentiment, and refinement of taste, are almost synonymous with epithets of weakness, and that those beings who are only the subjects of pity and that kind of love will soon become objects of contempt. I wish to those that the first object of laudable ambition is to attain a character as human being, regardless of the distinction of sex." Between the American Revolution and Civil War, elements of American society were changing. The growth of population, the movement westward, and the development of the factory system. Expansion of political rights for white men, educational growth to match the new economic needs. That changes were bound to take place in the situation of women. In pre-industrial America, the practical need for women in a frontier society had produced some measure of equality. Women were at important jobs, publishing newspapers, managing tanneries, keeping taverns, engaging in skill work. In certain professions, like midwifery, they had a monopoly. Nancy Coate tells of a grandmother, Martha Moore Ballard, on a farm in Maine in 1795, who, quote, "baked and brewed, pickled and preserved, spun and sewed, made soap and dipped candles," end quote, and who, in 25 years as midwife, delivered more than 1,000 babies. Since education took place inside the family, women had a special role there. There was complex movement in different directions. Now women were being pulled out of the house and into industrial life, while at the same time there was pressure for women to stay home, where they were more easily controlled. The outside world, breaking into the solid cubicle of the home, created fears and tensions in the dominant male world, and brought forth ideological controls to replace the loosening family controls. The idea of, quote, the woman's place, promulgated by men, was accepted by many women. As the economy developed, men dominated as mechanics and tradesmen, and aggressiveness became more and more defined as a male trait. Women perhaps precisely became more of them were moving into dangerous the world outside. Were told to be passive. Clothing styles developed for the rich and middle class, of course. But as always, there was the intimidation of style even for the poor, in which the weight of women's clothes, corsets, and petticoats emphasized female separation from the world of activity. And what he's referencing is fashion changed over time. Women wore the big dresses to smaller but tighter clothing, to a bit more bigger clothing that kind of didn't fit right. Some stuff did. So that's what he's that's what he's trying to emphasize is the women's clothing designs were chosen on purpose, and you'll see that more of that soon. It became important to develop a set of ideas taught in church, in school, and in the family to keep women in their place, even as the place became more and more unsettled. Barbara Welter, Dimity Convictions, had shown how powerful was the, quote, cult of true womanhood. In the years after 1820, the woman was expected to be pious. A man writing in the Ladies' Repository, quote, religion is exactly what a woman needs, for it gives her that dignity that best suits her dependence, end quote. Miss John Sanford, in her book Woman and Her Social Domestic Character, said, quote, religion is just what woman needs. Without it, she is ever restless or unhappy. What he's saying is, religion was a way to control women. Sexual purity was to be the special virtue of a woman. It was assumed that men, as a matter of biological nature, would sin, but women must not surrender. As one male author said, quote, if you do, you'll be left and settle into sadness to beware your cruelty, imbecility, duplicity, and premature prostitution, end quote. A woman wrote that females would get into trouble if they were, quote, high-spirited, not prudent, end quote. The world began early, with adolescence. Obedience prepared the girl for submission to the first proper mate. Barbara Welter describes this. The assumption is twofold. The American female was supposed to be so infinitely lovable and provocative that a healthy male could barely control himself. When in the same room with her, and the same girl as she, quote, comes out, unquote, of the cocoon of her family's protectiveness, is so palpitating with undirected affection, so filled to the brim with tender feelings that she fixes her love on the first person she sees. She wakes from the midsummer nights, dream of the adolescence, and that is responsibility for family and society. To see that her eyes fall on suitable match and not some clown with a heaven ass, they do their part but restrictedness. Measures as segregated by sex and her class, schools, dancing classes, travel, and other external controls. She is required to exert the inner control obedience, the combination forms of Kind's societal chastity belt, which is not unlocked until the marriage partner has arrived and adolescence is formally over. Stuff like that still happens today. I mean, not really this end part here, but the part about the way women dress. Is that a lot of men, when they see women in a certain type of clothing, or wearing some kind of makeup, or acting a certain way, they can't control themselves. They want to go up to her. They want to sexually assault her. They want to make her theirs. And that is what he's referring to, and that's what this woman's referring to in this passage right here. When Amelia Bloomer in 1851 suggested in her feminist publication that women wear a kind of short skirt and pants to free themselves from the encumbrances of traditional dress. This was attacked in the popular women's literature. One story has a girl admiring the, quote, bloomer costume, but her professor admonishes her that they are, quote, only of the many manifestations of the wild spirit of socialism and agrarian radicalism which is at present so rife in our land, end quote. You can see men starting to rebel and starting to push resistance against freeing women and allowing them to wear what they want. in the Young Lady's Book of 1830, quote, "In whatever situation of a life a woman is placed from her cradle to her grave, a spirit of obedience and submission, pliability of temper, and humility of mind are required from her," end quote. And a woman wrote in 1850 in the book of Greenwood Leaves, end quote, "True feminine genius is ever timid, doubtful and clinging, dependent a perpetual childhood," end quote. Another book, Recollections of a Southern Mansion, quote, "If any habitat of his annoyed me, I spoke it once or twice, calmly then bore it quietly," end quote. Giving women, quote, "rules from conjugal and domestic happiness," end quote. One book ended with, quote, "Do not expect too much," end quote. The woman's job was to keep the home cheerful, maintain religion, be nurse, cook, cleaner, seamstress, flower arranger. A woman shouldn't read too much, and certain books should be avoided. When Harriet Martineau, a reformer of the 1830s, wrote Society in America, one reviewer suggested it to be kept away from women, quote, "Such reading will unsettle them for their true station and pursuits, and they will throw the world back again into confusion." What he's saying is we got to keep women in their basic roles. We can't allow them to realize, hey, we have power, we have strength, we can do the exact same as men can, and that's what this guy's talking about. A sermon preached in 1808 in New York. "How interesting and important are the duties devolved unto females as wives, the counsel and friend of her husbands, who makes it her daily study to lighten her cares, to soothe his sorrows, and to augment his joys, who, like a guardian angel, watches over his interest, warns him against dangers, comforts him until trials, and by her previous, assiduous, and attractive deportment, constantly endeavors to render him more virtuous, more useful, more honorable, and more happy." Women were also urged, especially since they had the job of educating children, to be patriotic. One Woman's Magazine offered a prize to the woman who wrote the best essay on, quote, how may an American woman best show her patriotism, end quote. It was in the 1820s and 30s. Nancy Cott tells us, "The Bonds of Womanhood," the name of the book, that there was an outpouring of novels, poems, essays, sermons, and manuals on the family, children, and women's roles. The world outside was becoming harder, more commercial, more demanding. In a sense, the home carried a longing for some utopian past, some refuge from immediacy. Perhaps it made acceptance of the new economy easier to be able to see it as only a part of life. With the Home of Haven, in 1819, one pious wife wrote, quote, "The air of the world is poisonous. You must carry an antidote with you, or the infection will prove fatal," end quote. All this was not, as Scott points out, to challenge the world of commerce, industry, competition, capitalism, but to make it more palatable. The cult of domesticity for the woman was a way of pacifying her with a doctrine of, quote, "separate but equal," end quote, giving her work equally as important as a man's, but separate, inside that, quote, equality. There was the fact that the woman did not choose her mate, and once her marriage took place, her life was determined. One girl wrote in 1791, quote, "This die is about to be cast, which will probably determine the future happiness or misery of my life. I have always anticipated the event with a degree of solemnity almost equal to that which will terminate my present existence," end quote. Marriage and chained, and children doubled the chains. One woman writing in 1813, quote, "They are due soon of giving birth to my third child, and the consequent duties I shall be called to discharge distress me so I feel as I shall sink," end quote. This despondency was lightened by the thought that something important was given the woman to do to impart to her children the moral values of self-restraint and advancement through individual excellence rather than common action. The new ideology worked. It helped to produce the stability needed to by growing economy, but its very existence showed that other currents were at work, not easily contained, and given the woman her spirit created by the possibilities that she might use that space, that time, to prepare it for another kind of life. The, quote, cult of true womanhood, end quote, could not completely erase what was visible as evidence of woman's subordinate status. She could not vote, could not own property. When she did work, her wages were 1/4 to 1/2 what men earned in the job. Same job. Women were excluded from the professions of law and medicine from colleagues from the ministry. Now again, this is still like this today. A woman can be an engineer like a man, same exact place, same exact job, and she'd make 50 cents or a dollar less. Putting all women in the same category, giving them all the same domestic sphere to cultivate, created a classification by sex, by which blurred the lines of class. As Nancy Cobb points out, however, forces were at work to keep raising the issue of class. Samuel Slater had introduced industrial spinning machinery in New England in 1789, and now there was a demand for young girls, literally spinsters. You know, the girls who work the machines to weave the clothing and to make some of the fabrics and the stuff that they use on a daily basis. To work the spinning machinery in factories. In 1814, the power loom was introduced in Waltham, Massachusetts. Now all the operations needed to turn cotton fiber into cloth were under one roof. The new textile factories swiftly multiplied, with women 80-90% of their operatives. Most of these women between 15 and 30. Some of the earliest industrial strikes took place in these textile mills in the 1830s. Eleanor Flexner, A Century of Struggle, gives figures that suggest why women's daily average earnings in 1836 were less than 37.5 cents, and thousands earned 25 cents a day. Working 12 to 16 hours a day in Pawtucket, Rhode Island in 1824 came the first known strike of women factory workers. 202 women joined men in protesting a wage cut and longer hours, but they met separately. 4 years later, women in Dover, New Hampshire, struck alone, and in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1834. When a young woman was fired from her job, other girls left their looms. One of them then climbing the town pump and making, according to a newspaper report, quote, a flaming Mary Wollstonecraft speech on the rights of women and the iniquities of the, quote, moneyed aristocracy, end quote. Now, this is the time when monopolies were booming like crazy from oil, textiles, agriculture, other industries, which produced a powerful effect on her auditors, and they determined to have their own way if they died for it, end quote. A journal kept an unsympathetic resident of Chicopee, Massachusetts, recorded an event of May 22nd, 1843. Great turnout among the girls. After breakfast this morning, a procession proceeded by the painted window curtain, for a banner went around the square, the number 16. They soon came past again, the number 44. They marched around a while when dispersed. After dinner they sailed forth to the number 42 and marched around the cabat. They marched around the streets, doing themselves no credit. What he's saying is he's trying to discredit. He's trying to say that, oh, this protest is not a big deal, it doesn't matter, don't look at it. That's what he's trying to do. It's a distraction. And you also see here, this is what I talked about not too long ago, was this is the time period that not only labor strikes, but women were part of that as well. Even some cases leading the charge. There were strikes in various cities in the 1840s, more militant than those early New England coal turnouts. But most unsuccessfully, a succession of strikes in the Allegheny mills near Pittsburgh demanded a shorter work day. Several times in these strikes, women armed with sticks and stones broke through wooden gates of a textile mill and stopped the looms. Catherine Beecher, a woman reformer at the time, wrote about the factory system. Let me not present the facts I learned by observation or inquiry on the spot. I was there in midwinter, and every morning I was awakened at 5 by the bells calling to labor. The time allowed for dressing and breakfast was so short. So many told me that both were performed hurriedly, and then the work at the mill was begun by lamplight, and prosecuted without remission till 12, and chiefly in a standing position, then half an hour only allowed for dinner, for which the time were going, and returning we deducted, then back to the mills, to the works till 7 o'clock. It must be remembered that all hours of labor are spent in rooms where oil lamps together with from 40 to 80 persons, are exhausted of the healthful principle of the air, and where the air is loaded with particulars of cotton thrones, from thousands of cards, spindles, and looms. In the life of upper-class women, Frances Trollope, an Englishwoman, in her book Domestic Manners of the Americans, wrote, let me be permitted to describe the day of a Philadelphian lady for the first class. This lady shall be the wife of a senator, a lawyer in the highest repute and practice. She rises, and for her first hour is spent in the scrupulously nice arranged of her dress. She descends to a parlor neat, stiff, and silent. Her breakfast is brought to her by her free black footman. She eats her fried ham and her saltfish. She drinks her coffee in silence, while her band reads one newspaper, and puts another under his elbow, and then perhaps she washes the cups and saucers. Her carriage is ordered at 11. At that hour she is still employed in the pastry room, her snowy white apron protecting her mouse-colored silk. 20 minutes before her carriage should appear, she retires to her chamber, as she calls it, shakes and folds up her still snow-white apron, smooths her red dress, and sets on her elegant bonnet. Then walks downstairs just at the moment then her free black coachman announces to her free black footman that the carriage waits. She steps into it and gives the word, quote, "Drive to the Dorcas Society," end quote. As at Lowell, a female labor reform association put out a series of, quote, factory tracts. The first was entitled, quote, "Factory Life as It Is by an Operative," end quote, and spoke of the textile mill women as, quote, "nothing more nor than less slaves in every sense of the word. Slaves to a system of labor which requires them to toil from 5 until 7 o'clock, with 1 hour only to attend to the wants of nature. Slaves to the will and requirements of the powers that be." In 1845, the New York Sun carried this item, quote, "Mass meeting of young women," end quote. "We are requested to call the attention of the young women of the city arranged in industrious pursuits to call for a mass meeting in the park this afternoon at 4 o'clock. We are also requested to appeal to the gallantry of the men of the city and respectfully ask them not to be present at this meeting, and those who benefit, it is called, prefer to deliberate by themselves." Around that time, the New York Herald carried a story about, quote, 700 females, generally in the most interesting state and appearance, unquote, meeting, quote, in their endeavor to remedy the wrongs and oppressions under which they labor, unquote. The Herald editorialized about such meetings, quote, "We are very much about whether it will terminate in much good to female labor and of any description, all combinations and in nothing," unquote. The title of Nancy Cott's book, The Bonds of Womanhood, reflects her double view of what was happening to women in the early 19th century. They were trapped in the bonds of the new ideology of, quote, women's sphere in the home, and when forced out to work in factories or in middle-class professions, found another kind of bondage. On the other hand, these conditions created a common conscience of their situation and forged bonds of solidarity among them. Middle-class women, barred from higher education, began to monopolize the profession of primary school teacher. As teachers, they read more, communicated more, and educated itself because subversive of old ways of thinking. They began to write for magazines and newspapers, and started some ladies' publications. Literacy among women doubled between 1780 and 1840. Women became health reformers. They formed movements against double standards in sexual behavior and the victimization of prostitutes. They joined in religious organizations. Some of the most powerful of them joined the anti-slavery movement. Some by the time a clear feminist movement emerged in the 1840s. Women had become practice organizers, agitators, and speakers. When Emma Willard addressed the New York legislature in 1819 on the subject of education for women, she was contradicting the statement made just the year before by Thomas Jefferson in a letter in which suggested women should not read novels, quote, as a mass of trash, with few exceptions, quote, for like a reason, too much poverty should not be indulged, and, quote, female education should concentrate, he said, quote, on ornaments too, on the amusements of life. These, for a female, are dancing, drawing, and music. Emma Willard told the legislature that the education of women, quote, has been too exclusively directed to fit them for displaying to advantage the charms of youth and beauty. And, quote, the problem, she said, was that, quote, the taste of men, whatever it might happen to be, has been made into a standard for the formation of the female character. And, quote, reason and religion teach us that, she said, that, quote, we too are primary existences, not the satellites of men, end quote. In 1821, Willard founded the Troy Female Seminary, the first recognized institutions for the education of girls. She wrote later how she could upset people by teaching her students about the human body. Mothers visited a class at the seminary in their early 30s, where she shocked at the sight of a pupil drawing a hat arteries and veins on a blackboard to explain the circulation of the blood, that they left the room in shame and dismay. To preserve the modesty of the girls and spare them too frequent agitation, heavy paper was pasted to the pages in their textbooks which depicted the human body. Women struggled to enter the all-male professional schools. Dr. Harriet Hunt, a woman physician who began to practice in 1835, was twice refused admission to Harvard Medical School, but she carried on her practice mostly among women and children. She believed strongly in her diet, exercise, hygiene, and mental health. She organized a Ladies' Physiological Society in 1843, where she gave monthly talks. She remained single, defying convention here too. Elizabeth Blackwell got her medical degree in 1849, having overcome many rebuffs before being admitted to Geneva College. She then set up the New York Dispensary for Poor Women and Children, quote, to give up to poor women an opportunity for consulting physicians of their own sex, unquote. In her first annual report, she wrote, "My first medical consultation was a curious experience. In a severe case of pneumonia and an elderly lady I called a consultation, a kind-hearted physical physician of high standing. There he began to walk about the room in some agitation, exclaiming, quote, a most extraordinary case. Such a one, heavy, happened to me before. I really do not know what to do, unquote. I listened in surprise and much perplexity, as it was a clear case of pneumonia and no unusual degree of danger, until at last I discovered that his perplexity related to me, not to the patient, and to the propriety of consulting with a lady physician." Oberlin College pioneered in the mission of women, but the first girl admitted to the theology school there. Antoinette Brown, who graduated in 1850, found that her name was left off the class list. With Lucy Stone, Oberlin founded a formidable resistor. She was active in the Peace Society and anti-slavery work, taught colored students, and organized a debating club for girls. She was chosen to write the commencement address, then was told it would be ready by a man. She refused to write it. Lucy Stone began lecturing on women's rights in 1847 in a church in Gardiner, Massachusetts, where her brother was a minister. She was tiny and weighed about 100 pounds. Was a marvelous speaker. As for the lecturer for the American Anti-Slavery Society, she was at various times deluged with cold water, sent reeling by a thrown book, attacked by mobs. When she married Henry Blackwell, they joined hands at their wedding and read a statement. While we acknowledge our mutual affection by publicly assuming the relationship of husband and wife, we deem it a duty to declare that this act on our part implies no sanction of, nor promise of voluntary obedience to such of the present laws of marriage as refuse to recognize the wife as an independent rational being, while they confer upon the husband as injurious and unnatural superiority. She was one of the first to refuse to give up her name after marriage. She was called Miss Stone when she refused to pay taxes because she was not representing the government. Officials took all her household goods in payment, even her baby's cradle. After Amelia Bloomer, a postmistress in a small town in New York State, developed the Bloomer, woman activist adopted in the place of the old whale-bonded bodice, and the corsets and petticoats. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was one of the leaders of the feminist movement in this period, told of how she first saw a cousin of hers wearing bloomers. To see my cousin with a lamp in one hand and baby in the other, walk upstairs with ease and grace while, with flowing robes, I pulled myself up with dignity, lamp and baby out of the question, readily convinced me that there was sore need of a reform in women's dresses, and I promptly donned a similar costume. Women, after becoming involved in other movements of reform, anti-slavery, temperance, dress styles, prison conditions, turned emboldened and experienced to their own situation. Angelina Grinke, a southern white woman who became a fierce speaker and organizer against slavery, saw that movement leading further. Let us all wake up to the nation to lift millions of slaves of both sexes from the dust and turn them into men and men. It will be an easy matter to take millions of females from their knees and set them on their feet, or in other words, transform them from babies into women. Margaret Fuller was perhaps the most formidable intellectual among the feminists. Her starting point in women in the 19th century was the understanding that, quote, there exists in the minds of a man of tone feeling toward women as toward slaves, unquote. She continued, quote, we would have every arbitrary barrier thrown down, we had every path open to woman as freely as to man, unquote. And, quote, what woman needs is not as a woman to act or rule, but as a nature to grow as an intellect, to discern as a soul to live freely and unimpeded, end quote. There was much to overcome. One of the most popular writers of the mid-19th century, the Reverend John Todd, one of his many best-selling books, gave advice to young men on the results of masturbation, end quote. Quote, the mind is greatly deteriorated, end quote, commented on the new feminist mode of dress. Some have tried to become semi-men by putting on the bloomer dress. Let me tell you in a word why it can never be done. It is woman robbed and folded, and long dress is beautiful. She walks gracefully. As she attempts to run, the charm is gone. Take off the robes and put on pants, and show the limbs, and grace and mystery all are gone. In the 1830s, a pastoral letter from the General Assembly of Ministers of Massachusetts commanded ministers to forbid women to speak from pulpits. Quote, when she assumes a place of man, we put ourselves in self-defense against her, end quote. Sarah Gumke, Angelina's sister, wrote in response a series of articles, quote, letters on the conditions of women and the equality of the sexes, end quote. During the early period of my lot was cast among the butterflies of the fashionable world. Out of this class of women, I am constrained to say both from experience and observation that their education is miserable, deficient, that they are taught to regard marriage as the one thing needful to only avenue to distinction. She said, quote, I ask no favors from my ex. I surrender not our claim to equality. All I ask of our brethren is that they will make their feet free from off our necks and permit us to stand upright on the ground which God has designed us to occupy. To me it is perfectly clear that whatsoever is morally right for a man to do, it is morally right for a woman to do, end quote. Sarah could write with power. Angelina was a firebrand speaker. Once she spoke 6 nights in a row at the Boston Opera House to the argument of some well-meaning fellow abolitionists that she should not advocate sexual equality because it was so outrageous to the common mind that would hurt the campaign for the abolition of slavery. She responded, we cannot push abolitionism forward with all our might until we take out the stumbling block off the road. If we surrender the right to speak in the public this year, then we surrender the right to petition next year, and the right to vote, the right the year after, and so on. What then can woman do for the slave when she herself is under the feet of man and chained into silence? Angelina was the first woman in 1838 to address a committee of the Massachusetts State Legislature on anti-slavery petitions. She later said, quote, I was near fainting under their tremendous pressure of feeling, end quote. Her talk attracted a huge crowd. A representative from Salem proposed that, quote, a committee be appointed to examine the foundations of the state of Massachusetts to see whether it would bear another lecture from Miss Grimke, end quote. Speaking on other issues prepared the way for speaking on the situation of women. Dorothea Dix, in 1843, addressed the legislature of Massachusetts on what she saw in the prisons and almshouses in the Boston area. I tell what I've seen, painful and shocking as the details are. I proceed, gentlemen, briefly to call your attention to the present state of insane persons confined within this commonwealth in cages, closets, collars, stalls, pains, chained and naked, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience. Frances Wright was a writer, founder of a utopian community, immigrant from Scotland in 1824, a fighter for the emancipation of slaves. For birth control and sexual freedom, she wanted free public education for all children over 2 years of age and state-supported boarding schools. She expressed in America what the utopian socialist Charles Fourier had said in France, that the progress of civilization depended on the progress of women, and her words, I shall venture the assertion that until women assume the place in society which good sense and good feeling alike assign to them, human improvement must advance but feebly. Men will never rise or fall to the level of the other sex. Let them not imagine that they know aught of the delights with intercourse with the other sex can give, until they have felt the sympathy of mind with mind and heart with heart, until they bring into that intercourse every affection, every talent, every confidence, every refinement, every respect, until the power is annihilated on one side, fear and obedience on the other, and both restored to their birthright equality. Unquote. Women put in enormous work in anti-slavery societies all over the country, gathering thousands of petitions to Congress. Eleanor Flexner writes in A Century of Struggle, today, countless file boxes in the National Archives in Washington bear witness to that anonymous and heartbreaking labor. The petitions are yellowed and frail, glued together page on page, covered with ink blots signed with scratchy pens, with an occasional erasure by one who fearfully thought better of so bold an act. They bear the names of women's anti-slavery societies from New England to Ohio. In the course of this work, events were set in motion that carried the movement for women of their own equality racing alongside the movement against slavery. In 1840, a World Anti-Slavery Society convention met in London. After a fierce argument, it was voted to exclude women, but it was agreed that they could attend meetings in a curtained enclosure. The women sat in silence protesting in the gallery, and William Lloyd Garrison, one abolitionist had fought for the rights of women, sat with them. It was at the time that Elizabeth Cady Stanton met Lucretia Mott and others and began to lay the plans that led to the first women's rights convention in history. It was held at Seneca Falls, New York, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton lived as a mother and housewife full of resentment at her condition, declaring, quote, "A woman is a nobody, a wife is everything," unquote, she wrote a letter. "I have now fully understood the practical difficulties most women had to contend within the most isolated household, and the possibility of women's best development if in contact. The chief part of our life with servants and children, the general discontent I felt with women's portion of life, as wife, mother, housekeeper, physician, and spiritual guide, the chaotic condition in which everything fell, without her constant supervision, and whether the feeling and worried, anxious look of majority of women impressed me with a strong feel that some active measures should be taken to remedy the wrongs of society, and general of women in particular. My experiences at the World Anti-Slavery Convention, all I had read our legal status of women and the oppression of I saw everywhere. Together we swept across my soul. I could not see what to do or where to begin. My only thought was a public meeting for protest and discussion. An announcement was put in the Seneca County Courier, calling for a meeting to discuss the, quote, rights of women. The 19th and 20th of July, 300 women and some men came. A declaration of principles was signed at the end of the meeting by 68 women and 32 men. It made the use of language and rhythm of the Declaration of Independence. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one portion of the family of man to assume among the people of the earth a position different from that they have hitherto occupied. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among all these life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. The history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward women, having a direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny of her. To prove this, let its facts be submitted to a candid world. Then came the list of grievances: no right to vote, no right to her wages or property, no right in divorce cases, no opportunity to employment, no entrance to colleges, ending with, quote, he had endeavored in every way that he could to destroy her confidence in her own powers, to lessen her self-respect, and to make her willing to lead a dependent and abject life. And then a series of resolutions including, quote, that all laws which prevent a woman from occupying such a station and society as her conscience shall dictate, or which place her in a position inferior to that of man, are contrary to the great precept of nature, and therefore of no force or authority, end quote. A series of women's conventions in various parts of the country followed the one at Seneca Falls. At one of these, in 1851, an aged black woman who had been born in the slave in New York, tall, thin, wearing a gray dress and white turban, listened to some male ministers who had been dominating the discussion. This was Sojourner Truth. She rose to her feet and joined the indignation of her race to the indignation of her sex. Quote, that the man over there says that woman needs to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches. Nobody helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place and ain't I a woman? Lifting my arm, I have plowed and planted and gathered in the barns, and no man could heed me. Ain't a woman? I would much work. I need as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I had borne 13 children and seen almost all of them sold off to slavery. When I cried out to my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman? There were women beginning to resist in the 1830s and 40s and 1850s. To attempt to keep them in their, quote, women's sphere, they were taking part in all sorts of movements, for prisoners, for the insane, for black slaves, and for all women. In the midst of these movements, there exploded, with the force of government and the authority of women, money, a quest for more land, an urge for national expansion. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you enjoyed Chapter 6 of our book. I enjoyed so far learning more about women's history and kind of some of these movements I didn't know about, and also just giving people greater understanding and more in-depth stories of what the life of women were in the early days of America into the 1800s to 19th century. In all cases too, I do apologize for any mispronunciations or maybe not completely reading something correctly. You know, it's really hard on the mouth and throat when you're reading for an hour and trying to read everything. You know, sometimes the mind speaks faster than the mouth and vice versa. But also, when it comes to the end of the day, I tend to want to like rush and get done so that I can get this saved and uploaded. So that's just my apology on my end. Other than that, I hope you guys enjoyed. Please share this, hit the like button, press the notification bell for those who may not always see these. And again, feel free to comment below on what I said in the beginning of the video and just your thoughts in general. And you guys have a great day.